Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was the first major coup orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency and one of the most consequential covert actions of the Cold War. In 1953, the United States and Britain collaborated to remove Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power after he nationalized the country's oil industry and ended decades of foreign control. For Britain, the issue was financial. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as BP, had held a monopoly over Iran's petroleum for decades. Nationalization cut off British access to vast profits, and the government in London pressed Washington to intervene. The Cold War provided the justification. Mossadegh was portrayed as unstable and potentially sympathetic to the Soviet Union, a risk that the United States was unwilling to tolerate. The CIA developed a covert plan codenamed Operation Ajax, directed on the ground by Kermit Roosevelt Jr. The strategy combined propaganda, bribery, and staged unrest. Iranian newspapers secretly funded by the CIA published articles attacking Mossadegh's character and policies. Politicians, clerics, and military officers were paid to withdraw their support for his government. Mobs were hired to riot in the streets, creating the appearance of nationwide disorder. Each element was designed to weaken Mossadegh's authority and strengthen the Shah of Iran. On August 19, 1953, the coup reached its climax. Military units loyal to the Shah stormed government buildings, and Mossadegh was forced to surrender. He was tried and placed under house arrest, where he remained until his death. The Shah returned to power with American and British backing, transforming from a constitutional monarch into an autocratic ruler. For decades, the details of Operation Ajax remained hidden. Official denials and classified files concealed the CIA's role. It was not until the 1990s that fragments of the truth emerged, and in 2013, declassified documents confirmed the full extent of American and British involvement. The U-2 spy plane. The U-2 spy plane was one of the CIA's most ambitious technological projects and a symbol of Cold War espionage. Developed in the mid-1950s, it was designed to fly at extreme altitudes, higher than any other aircraft of its time, to photograph enemy territory without being detected or intercepted. In an era before satellites, the U-2 gave the United States the ability to peer deep inside the Soviet Union and track its military capabilities. The project was launched in secret, with Lockheed's Skunk Works division handling the design under the direction of engineer Kelly Johnson. The aircraft was built with a slender fuselage, wide glider-like wings, and advanced cameras capable of capturing detailed images from over 70,000 feet. At that altitude, the US believed the plane would be safe from Soviet defenses. The program was run not by the Air Force, but by the CIA, adding another layer of secrecy. U-2 flights began in 1956, operating from bases in Europe and Asia. The photographs they brought back revealed missile sites, bomber bases, and nuclear facilities that had been hidden from American intelligence. For the first time, the United States could confirm the scale of the Soviet arsenal. The images helped dismantle the so-called bomber gap and later the missile gap, showing that the Soviet Union's capabilities were exaggerated. This knowledge shaped US strategy at the height of the Cold War, but the sense of invulnerability did not last. On May 1, 1960, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile while flying over central Russia. Powers was captured alive, and the wreckage was displayed in Moscow. The incident occurred just days before a planned summit between President Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. When the United States was forced to admit that the CIA had been conducting surveillance flights, the summit collapsed and tensions between the superpowers deepened. Operation PBSUCCESS. Operation PBSUCCESS was one of the earliest Cold War coups organized by the CIA and a defining moment in the history of US involvement in Latin America. In 1954, the United States moved to overthrow Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, after he enacted land reforms that threatened the interests of foreign corporations and challenged American influence in the region. The source of tension was the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation that controlled vast tracts of Guatemalan land. Arbenz sought to redistribute unused acreage to peasants as part of an agrarian reform program. Although the company was offered compensation, it lobbied the US government to intervene, portraying the reforms as communist-inspired. In the climate of the Cold War, that argument found a receptive audience in Washington. The CIA prepared a covert plan under the codename Operation PBSUCCESS. The agency recruited and armed a small force led by exiled Guatemalan officer Carlos Castillo Armas. With training and support from U.S. operatives, this group staged cross-border raids and psychological operations. Propaganda broadcasts spread panic by claiming that a massive rebel army was advancing. Leaflets were dropped over towns warning of an imminent uprising. At the same time, the CIA bribed military officers and officials to withdraw their support for Arbenz. By June 1954, the pressure had become overwhelming. Although the invading force was small and poorly equipped, the perception of a larger movement combined with internal defections undermined the government. Facing growing isolation, Arbenz resigned and went into exile. Carlos Castillo Armas seized power with U.S. backing, and Guatemala's democratic experiment came to an end. The Berlin Tunnel. The Berlin Tunnel was one of the boldest intelligence operations of the Cold War. In the early 1950s, the CIA and Britain's MI6 devised a plan to dig a tunnel beneath East Berlin to tap into Soviet communication lines. Officially known as Operation Gold, the project was built in complete secrecy and became a symbol of the ingenuity and risks taken in the battle for information. At the time, Berlin was divided, with Soviet forces controlling the eastern sector. Communication cables carrying phone and telegraph traffic for the Red Army and East German authorities ran underground, providing a rich target for Western intelligence. The plan was to intercept these cables directly, recording conversations and transmissions that could reveal Soviet strategies, troop movements, and political directives. Construction began in 1954 from the American sector. Engineers dug a tunnel nearly 1,500 feet long, reinforced with steel and concrete, leading directly under the border into East Berlin. The work was carried out in silence, with equipment muffled and soil removed under cover of night to avoid detection. At the end of the tunnel, the cables were carefully tapped and recording devices were installed to capture every message passing through. For nearly a year, the tunnel provided valuable intelligence. Thousands of hours of conversations and millions of words were intercepted, giving Western analysts unprecedented insight into Soviet operations in East Germany. It was one of the most productive intelligence-gathering efforts of its time, but the tunnel's success did not last. In 1956, East German workers uncovered it while repairing cables, and the Soviets quickly exposed the operation to the world. Publicly, they denounced it as an act of espionage and propaganda. What was not known at the time was that the KGB had been aware of the tunnel from the very beginning, thanks to a mole inside British intelligence, George Blake. Still, to protect their source, the Soviets allowed the taps to operate for months, feeding real intelligence to the CIA while also limiting sensitive traffic. Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was one of the most famous failures in CIA history and a turning point in the Cold War. In April 1961, the United States attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba by training and supporting an army of Cuban exiles. The operation was conceived in secrecy, designed to appear as a domestic uprising, but it ended in humiliation and had lasting consequences for U.S. policy. After coming to power in 1959, Castro moved quickly to nationalize industries, redistribute land, and align with the Soviet Union. For Washington, the rise of a communist state just 90 miles from Florida was unacceptable. Under the Eisenhower administration, the CIA developed a plan to remove him from power. The program continued under President John F. Kennedy, who inherited the plan shortly after taking office. The CIA recruited more than 1,000 Cuban exiles, training them in Guatemala and Nicaragua. They were equipped with American weapons, given transport ships, and backed by covert air support. The plan was to land at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast, establish a beachhead, and trigger an uprising against Castro's regime. On April 17, 1961, the invasion began. The exiles landed on the beaches under heavy fire, but the expected local uprising never materialized. Castro's forces responded quickly, deploying tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The invading force was pinned down with little room to maneuver. Promised U.S. air support was scaled back at the last moment, leaving the exiles without cover. Within 3 days, the operation collapsed. More than 100 invaders were killed, and over 1,000 were captured. Publicly, the United States denied involvement, but the evidence was undeniable. The ships, weapons, and training all trace back to the CIA. The failure was a political disaster for Kennedy, strengthening Castro's position at home and pushing Cuba into a closer alliance with the Soviet Union. The events at the Bay of Pigs set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year, one of the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone was one of the longest and most expensive covert programs in CIA history, and its consequences shaped the modern world. Beginning in 1979, the agency secretly armed and funded Afghan fighters to wage war against the Soviet Union, transforming a local conflict into a global battleground of the Cold War. When Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to support a communist government in Kabul, Washington saw an opportunity. The Carter administration authorized the CIA to begin supplying weapons and money to the Afghan resistance. Under the Reagan administration, the program expanded dramatically. Billions of dollars in arms, training, and logistical support flowed into the country over the next decade. The operation relied on partnerships with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, which funneled supplies to a variety of Afghan mujahideen groups. Fighters received rifles, explosives, and eventually advanced weapons such as the FIM-92 Stinger missile, which allowed them to shoot down Soviet helicopters and aircraft. Training camps provided instruction in guerrilla tactics, and cash payments kept the war effort alive. The impact was immediate. Soviet forces found themselves facing a relentless insurgency that could not be crushed. Mountain ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the growing effectiveness of anti-aircraft weapons turned the war into a costly stalemate. By 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, and Operation Cyclone was hailed in Washington as a major victory. But the long-term consequences were more complex. The flow of weapons and money strengthened militant networks that did not disappear when the Soviets left. Some fighters, radicalized by years of war, turned their attention to new targets. Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was one of the most disturbing branches of the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Beginning in the 1950s, the agency set up a network of safe houses disguised as brothels in San Francisco and New York. Behind their walls, unsuspecting men were lured inside, drugged with LSD, and observed from behind one-way mirrors as part of experiments in mind control. The operation was run by CIA officer George Hunter White, a former narcotics agent who managed the safe houses like private laboratories. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to bring clients back to the apartments, where their drinks were secretly dosed with hallucinogens. Once the drugs took hold, the subject's behavior was carefully monitored and recorded. The rooms were fitted with microphones, cameras, and mirrored glass, turning intimate encounters into experiments. The program was designed to test how drugs, sex, and psychological manipulation could be combined for interrogation and blackmail. Researchers studied how LSD altered judgment, how far subjects could be pushed under stress, and how secrets might be extracted when their defenses were lowered. These were not willing participants. Most of the men had no idea they were being used as test subjects for classified research. The secrecy surrounding the safe houses was extreme. Funds for the operation were hidden in CIA budgets, and few outside the agency even knew it existed. For years, the experiments continued without oversight, producing little usable science but leaving a trail of ethical violations. Operation Midnight Climax came to light in the 1970s, when congressional investigations into CIA activities uncovered fragments of MKUltra. Many files had already been destroyed, but testimony from former officials confirmed the scope of the program. Operation Condor. Operation Condor was one of the most far-reaching covert campaigns of the Cold War. Beginning in the mid-1970s, it was a secret alliance of South American military dictatorships that joined forces to hunt down, torture, and eliminate political opponents across national borders. With quiet support from the United States, it became a continental system of repression. The roots of Condor lay in a wave of military coups that swept South America. In Chile, Augusto Pinochet seized power in 1973. Argentina followed with its own dictatorship, and soon Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil were under authoritarian rule. Each regime faced resistance from leftist movements, union students, and exiles who tried to escape persecution by crossing borders. Condor was created to make sure there was nowhere to hide. Intelligence agencies from the member states shared lists of targets through a secure communications network, while the CIA provided technical assistance, surveillance equipment, and training. A dissident fleeing Argentina could be identified in Chile, captured, and secretly transported back to face interrogation and execution. Many were held in clandestine prisons where torture was routine. Others simply disappeared, their bodies never recovered. The campaign operated in total secrecy, but its reach was vast. Thousands of people were abducted, and tens of thousands were killed or disappeared during the years Condor was active. In 1976, its operations even crossed into the United States, when a car bomb in Washington, D.C. killed former Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier and his colleague Ronnie Moffat. The attack, carried out by Condor agents, showed that the network extended far beyond South America. For decades, Condor's existence was denied. Families of the disappeared searched for answers, while governments insisted no such program existed. It was only after the fall of the dictatorships that archives and testimonies revealed the full scope of the network. Declassified U.S. documents confirmed that Washington had known of Condor and provided support under the logic of fighting communism. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Subscribe if you would like to see similar videos. Thank you again, and goodbye.